This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's June 23rd, 2021. I'm Ross John Fortune. About a year ago, millions protested around the country and around the world against racial injustice in the United States. While police violence was the main crux of many of the rallies, broader conversations around economic and social equality came to the forefront of the culture. Inside of that is the conversation about Black wealth and economic mobility in the United States. The COVID-19 pandemic has created disproportionate challenges for Black Americans rooted in structural inequalities that have been mostly ignored by the public and private sectors. Across the spectrum, Black Americans were hit hard by the pandemic, from business owners without access to the financial institutions connected to the Paycheck Protection Program to essential workers without access to public health resources like testing, vaccines, and basic health services. A report released last week by the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility and the McKinsey Global Institute identifies the largest gaps Black people continue to face as business owners, as consumers, and as Americans served by public programs. The report also produces recommendations for industry and government on how to invest in Black communities, close the wealth gap, and increase Black economic mobility. JP Julien is an associate partner at McKinsey & Company. He's also the lead author of the report and one of the co-leaders of McKinsey's Institute for Black Economic Mobility. After a short break, he'll join me to talk about the report's findings and its recommendations. Are you curious about government modernization? Look no further than the IT Modernization Virtual Summit brought to you by NextGov, Defense One, and Route 50. Tune in on June 30th to dive into the biggest challenges and opportunities in government modernization, including DevOps, app migration, funding, and more. Register today at nextgov.com/events. That's nextgov.com/EVENTS. Last week, the Biden administration designated Juneteenth as a federal holiday, marking the first time the day has been recognized nationwide as such. A report released last week by the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility and the McKinsey Global Institute identifies the biggest gaps Black people continue to face as business owners, consumers, and as Americans served by public programs. JP Julien is the lead author of the report and one of the co-leaders of McKinsey's Institute for Black Economic Mobility. He joins us now to discuss the report's findings and recommendations. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So the report enumerates the ways that the racial wealth gap is lacking and Black economic mobility is lacking in the U.S. We'll start with private industry. How does the business world sort of contribute to these problems?
Yeah. So the first thing is there's a complicated set of problems that got us here. And so we do believe that coordinated and collective action is going to be needed to move forward. And so the private sector has a unique role to play in that it has a scale that is quite large and can move quite quickly relative to others. And so as we looked across the 5 roles, there are some specific ways that the private sector plays an outsized role. So for example, there's 20 million Black Americans in the labor force. 45% of them are in healthcare, retail, accommodation, food service, a lot of frontline work. And so as we think about the quality of employment, living wages, predictable hours, these are ways that employers directly in the private sector has an outsized role to ensure that Black Americans are supported and able to sustain their families.
That is there sort of pressure from the outside to bring the private industry in that way, just because there's the pushback, I guess, would be that the invisible hand of the market is such that this is not in private industry's best interest, because you do see over the last year in particular corporations.
Yeah.
And again, your mileage may vary on whether it's lip service, self-interest, or public good. But where does sort of the pressures need to come there?
So it's funny you mentioned the last year, because what we've seen is that over the past year, corporations, particularly the Fortune 1000, has dedicated about $200 billion towards racial equity, racial justice efforts. And so I think it's exciting that it's more than lip service, at least this time around. I think where corporations are realizing is that their employees are demanding that they do something differently. So there's some really good survey data out there that 60+% of all employees expect their corporations to say something about racial justice and to come out in support of racial equity. I think increasingly we're seeing investors actually take a real interest in this. And so you have groups like Carlyle that are actually tying the cost of capital to the diversification of boards that corporations have. And I think increasingly consumers are expecting it, right? And so as you think about where there's opportunity in the market, I think what this report also highlights is it's not that this is just a social good. There's real economic opportunity being left on the table by underserving and not serving particular markets well. And so I think corporations are starting to finally realize that there is real opportunity. And I think the pressures from their customers, their employees, and investors are definitely starting to come to the fore.
Yeah, that's interesting. There seems to be, from a broad sort of even self-interested perspective, there seems to be much more. We've talked on this show a little bit when it came to voting rights and stuff. The notion that like public participation is good for everyone, and in the case of industry, it's much more more innovation and more brains. More different types of brains and more different types of people, and all all the notions of ideas come from you want to get
more diverse groups. Yep.
Yeah, having those kinds of voices are always helpful because it does help at the very least serve more markets and make you more money. Well, let's I mentioned the last year or so, the overarching umbrella over the last year, the dark cloud has been the pandemic. How did it contribute to the problems with Black economic mobility and the racial wealth gap?
So I think the pandemic created some new problems, but in a lot of ways, it just largely magnified problems that have existed for a long time. So as we think about in each of the roles that we explored, the pandemic had an outsized negative impact on Black communities. And so we think about workers, for example. What we found, and we did this research actually during the start of COVID, was Black workers are overrepresented in 9 of the 10 lowest wage jobs considered high contact essential work. So things like nursing assistants, orderlies, restaurant workers. And so you have this compounding issue where they're in low wage work and they are considered essential. And so, as you would imagine, higher likelihood of being able to contact COVID. And we saw that play out on the health side, right? And so rates of case counts and deaths from the pandemic for Black Americans across the country, 2 to 3 times what they should be relative to their population. You saw the same thing on the business owner side, right? And so many entered the pandemic with a higher likelihood of financial distress. And so about 60% of Black-owned businesses were in financial distress in 2019, compared to about 27% of white-owned businesses. You then compound that with the fact that they're over-concentrated in some of the hardest hit sectors. So about 40% of Black-owned business revenues were in things like leisure and hospitality, retail, personal care. And those are the sectors that were most disproportionately negatively impacted by the pandemic. You then compound that with programs like the PPP, which are super well intentioned, but require relationships with financial institutions to be able to access them, where Black and Latin-owned businesses are less likely to have that relationship. And so even things like that are meant to kind of support them through the pandemic were not necessarily marketed through the right channels such that they would be able to access them. And so I think what we've realized is that the pandemic has really been this watershed moment and a real opportunity for us to think about what the future looks like in hopefully a different way.
Access does seem to be the buzzword, such as it were, with regards to inequality during the pandemic, for sure. From testing access to vaccine access to, as you note, the triple P, having those financial relationships really did show the limits of those kinds of things. We talk about the pandemic. Healthcare access is such a big part of that. How does the sort of public health system and more broadly public health care, or more broadly healthcare access, hinder economic mobility in the Black community?
Health is such just a critical good that folks need to be able to participate in the economy, right? So the ability to go to work, to support your family, to engage civically in your community, all of these things, if you are not healthy and have access to healthcare, are just that much more meaningfully difficult. And so what I think we see in the data is that Black Americans do, to your point, struggle with access to healthcare. And so 41% of Black Americans live in a healthcare desert where there are fewer providers, higher time to get to providers, which is 2.5 times the rate of white Americans. We also have a geographic concentration of Black Americans that also has a real interplay here. And so 60% of Black workers, for example, live in the South. We also know that the 8 states that have not expanded Medicaid are disproportionately where a lot of Black people live. And so Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Mississippi, all these places where if Medicaid were to be expanded, our report estimates that 1 million additional Black Americans could have access to Medicaid. And so we see this healthcare access both from a geographical standpoint and just given kind of the neighborhoods in which Black communities are living within those places are less likely to access healthcare, which, as I mentioned, without health, being a productive worker or successful entrepreneur, or the ability to save, having to, really think about medical debt, or the ability to consume other goods and services, really does become limited just because healthcare is that critical of enabler as we think about the rest of the roles that folks play.
So we'll end on this, and it's sort of related to that question, which is, the report says, quote, the racial wealth gap is persistent and structural, but not entirely immutable. Now, our audience is mostly public servants. So how can, the federal government, local government, ameliorate some of the things that we have talked about? How can public programs increase access to wealth and sort of break down some of the barriers that reside here between Black people and building wealth, economic mobility, and those sorts of things?
I think this is actually an exciting time for the public sector because they really can embrace impact in a new way. I think the first thing to realize is that the public sector has a unique vantage point and set of roles that it plays, whether it's in setting policy or enforcing and regulating the markets or investing. We've seen over the past year and a half or so, $4.5 trillion of federal investment, which is kind of unprecedented. They're a direct provider of tons of services that we talk about in the report. And so I think really embracing that role, that there is power there that can really move the needle. The second is to really understand what is wrong and what's not working. And so I hope that our report provides some of that to folks that are in government, thinking about what are the problems that really need to move in order for Black folks to experience more mobility. But to then understand both what's working and what's not working and what's causing harm potentially. And how do we think about not just creating new action, but stopping action that may be disproportionately hurting Black Americans. And then the last thing is just committing to action that equitably addresses these challenges. And so we talk a lot about, a colleague of mine, Shelley Stewart, often says, we talk a lot about raising the ceiling, but don't do enough to lift the floor. And what he means by that is we've tolerated a quality of life for way too many Americans in this country, over 100 million or so that are, within 200% of the federal poverty level, that we can make different if we decided to, right? And so how we think about living wages and worker protections and safety net programs become a really important part of that discussion. I think the federal government can then also really equitably invest in people and places. So as we think about public health infrastructure and how we shore that up to ensure that both this pandemic ends quickly, but that we don't have disproportionate impact of whatever's next down the line. Physical and digital infrastructure or human capital, all these things, the federal government has an outsized role in both directly investing and spurring investment from the private sector and the philanthropic sector to make happen. So those would be some of the initial things that I think that particularly the public sector is uniquely well positioned to do. And so it's an exciting time for us to really lean into what a new future could look like.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how these kind of crises change things. We've had guests on about during the how HUD changed in the 60s and the unintended consequences and the intended consequences of that. And perhaps these last few years will spur some more positive change when it comes to, sort of economic equity and, across communities.
Yeah.
That's it. Thanks so much for being on the show with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show was produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortuny. We want to thank McKinsey's JP Julien for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dance. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.